Territories. Today we are focusing this afternoon on housing. In our panel today, we're going to be thinking about innovation in housing, but we're going to start by thinking about what's our current situation, right? What's our steady state? Thinking about homelessness, tackling zoning regulations, supporting renters, increasing supply. Housing has become increasingly a top priority for cities and states. It's part of the national conversation in a new way. It was a big theme across the presidential campaigns. And today we have just a great panel that we've brought together to help us think about this. So first, I'm going to introduce Seila Mosquera Bruno, who is the Commissioner of Housing in the midst of her second term, appointed by Governor Ned Lamont. As Commissioner, she leads the state agency responsible for all affordable housing matters, including development, preservation, and homeless prevention. The Department of Housing administers more than $200 million in homeless and emergency support services and more than $800 million for development and preservation. Under Seila's tenure, the Department of Housing has completed construction of 13,000 units of housing with 6,400 currently under construction and administered hundreds of millions of dollars during the COVID for emergency relief, developing rapid response rent relief programs, and redesigning emergency shelters with the use of hotels and micro units to reimagine the homeless shelter experience by adding wraparound services and creating regional hubs. In the last 3 years, Seila has been responsible for creating 2 signature programs to accelerate housing development and home ownership: Time to Own, the state's first down payment assistance loan program for first-time home buyers, which since its launch a couple of years ago has served over 6,000 Connecticut residents. And the second, Build for CT, which is a workforce-specific gap financing program for developers building market rate housing, launched as a direct response to rising costs from supply chains and inflation. Prior to serving as commissioner, Seila had lots of experience on the ground right here in New Haven, serving as president and chief executive officer of NeighborWorks New Horizons, a nonprofit dedicated to providing affordable housing. She has a master's in urban studies from Southern Connecticut, a BA from Charter Oak College, and has been a fellow of Harvard's JFK School of Government, as well as frequent guest lecturer on housing policy right here at Yale and at NYU. So welcome, Seila. We're excited to have you here with us today. Next we have Next, we have Jenny Schutz, Dr. Jenny Schutz, who leads Arnold Ventures' infrastructure portfolio for housing. In this role, she oversees Arnold Ventures' efforts to identify and enact policies that can successfully expand housing supply and make it easier to build more and different types of housing. Jenny is relatively new at Arnold Ventures, but a lot of us came to know her through her prolific work at Brookings Metro, where she I don't want to say hundreds, but tens and tens and tens of articles systematically exploring this issue across the country and breaking it down for us in ways that were actionable. She's previously worked as adjunct lecturer in the Urban and Regional Planning Program at Georgetown, economist for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System, professor at USC and City College, senior research affiliate at NYU, and she began her career at Apt Associates. She has a PhD in public policy from Harvard University, a master's from MIT in city planning, and a bachelor's in economics and political and social thought from the University of Virginia, and has put all of that training to work to really help us think about this issue and in all its complexity. So, welcome. Okay, last but not least, we have David Kemper, Chief Executive Officer of Trust Neighborhoods, which is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, which is an organization that is building a model that came out of a series of conversations with neighborhoods across the country who are facing the pressures of, this housing crisis. And they have developed a multi-income neighborhood trust model that we're going to be hearing about today to address the kind of urgency and threats of displacement that can occur at the neighborhood level. David has helped to create New York City's Division of Capital Planning as its second employee and helped build Alphabet's Sidewalk Labs from a 4-person team to 40 while managing its housing and built environment work. So he brings a lot of previous experience with innovation into this new role. Began his career as an urban fellow and project manager in affordable housing finance under New York City's mayors Bloomberg and de Blasio, managing a pipeline of LIHTC and HUD multifamily deals. He has a BA right here in history from Yale College, an MPP from the University of Oxford, an MBA from Stanford Graduate School of Business, which we won't hold against you, but we want to welcome you back and excited to hear from all these perspectives, both from the national bird's eye view, from the state level, and from the neighborhood level about this urgent issue. So welcome, David. Okay, so I want to start with this question of the U.S. in a housing crisis. Jenny, let's start with you. Do you agree with that characterization that we are in a housing crisis? And how would you describe the roots of this crisis if you had to sort of diagnose it? And I'm picking on you first because the first chapter of her book, Fixer Upper, is titled Housing Sits at the Intersection of Several Complex Systems. So it is, but I've also heard you write about the sort of, it's the affordability crisis is really two types of affordability crisis. We can't think of it as a monolithic dynamic. So I invite you to reflect on that.
Yeah, I think it is helpful to think about the housing problems that we face in a couple of different buckets. And the housing affordability crisis, as I've said before, is really two different problems. So one of them that is very longstanding is that the U.S. has maybe the poorest 20 or 25% of households just don't earn enough income to afford market rate housing. This has been true for many, many decades. People just don't earn enough to pay for the operating costs of apartments. So if you talk to even a nonprofit housing provider, a Habitat for Humanity, or a nonprofit that runs affordable apartments, they will tell you they have to charge at least $800 rent in order to cover the mortgage and the property taxes, pay the insurance. And there are a bunch of households who just can't afford to pay $800 a month without spending half of their income on rent. So there's essentially an income problem for some people. And it's important to know that the solution to the gap between people's incomes and the cost of housing is only going to be solved by providing some direct subsidy. There's really no shortcut to that. And so that's sort of a bucket of problems that we have to solve. And we can talk about the prospects for doing that, particularly given how much states are now bearing. But the other problem that is getting more and more attention the last maybe 5 to 7 years, there's an affordability crisis and a housing shortage in many parts of the U.S. And that's fundamentally because we haven't built enough homes to keep up with the demand created by population growth and job growth. For a long time, this was primarily a problem of the big coastal metros, so Boston and New York, D.C., South Florida, and then most of the West Coast, Seattle, Portland, all of California. in the last 5 years, since COVID enabled more people to move to other cities, we have seen the affordability crisis caused by the lack of homes spread to more and more of the country. So places like Austin and Nashville and Denver that historically have been quite affordable, that used to build enough to keep up with demand, have not been able to, at least in the short term. And so we are seeing prices and rents go up faster than incomes in many parts of the country, and not enough homes being created in the places where people want to live, places that have great job markets, neighborhoods that have great public schools. So we're just not building enough homes in the right places. And that is largely a problem that we have created for ourselves. This is not the natural outcome of housing markets. Developers would love to build more homes in Boston and New York and San Francisco, but they're not allowed to do that. Local governments have the control over housing markets and housing development. Local governments, and to some extent state governments, have just made it really hard to build homes, have made it especially hard to build in high demand locations, and have made it hard to build anything except single family detached homes for sale, which are the most expensive kind of housing to build. So we have essentially prohibited ourselves from building lower cost housing and more accessible housing in the places that people most want to live. You know, the good news is, since we created this problem for ourselves, we can in theory solve it, but the politics turn out to be very, very difficult.
Yeah. So Selah, I'm going to turn to you next for the Connecticut view. To paraphrase Tolstoy, all housing markets are dysfunctional, but they're dysfunctional in their own unique ways, right? So thinking about the Connecticut context, I mean, nationally, the average house price has doubled. It's about $355,000 at the national level. In Connecticut, it's, $500,000. And we also have, this spring's typically the kickoff of the housing market. We have less homes, on the market in Connecticut, something like a 7% fewer, year over year than we did last year, and something around 8,000 homes for sale to meet, a much larger demand. So give us a sense of the view from how do these dynamics play out in Connecticut?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Actually, thank you for having me. Jenny, nice to see you again. So Connecticut is not immune to what is going on at the national level. I mean, all the things that Jenny mentioned, wages, 20 years of not building housing, and affordable housing for those lower earning workers. I started 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, we were fighting and trying to build housing that is affordable to our families and workers. And today, after 20 years, we are in the same place because we have not built enough. Now, Connecticut has unique challenges also. Besides, we have 169 towns, we have 169 mayors, municipalities, and regulations, and everybody wants to preserve what the town looks like. We have cities that has a lot of old housing stock, like New Haven. We have neighborhoods where people are living in substandard conditions, but are still paying a lot of money. But they still want to be in the city. They don't want to be out and about. So we have different challenges in addition to the ones that you mentioned overall, because some of us wanted to be in the city, and we don't want to go to the suburbs. Some of the people in the suburbs don't want to come to the city. So is that give and take, and how do we produce more all over, right? Rental housing. So our goal is to produce more rental housing for those individuals that need affordable. It's affordability that we're looking for, but also home ownership to provide that opportunity for many families and individuals that they can reach that American dream to be homeowners, to build equity, to be able to send their kids to school, because it's so expensive to go to school, and they cannot afford it. In the past, many years back, people will have their home where they had equity so that they can get loans and they can send the kids to school. So our goal is to keep building as much as we can, is to build in the suburbs as well as in the cities, and also doing a lot of the neighborhood revitalization is also to provide resources a little more intentional to the neighborhoods, because those neighborhoods do need that equity investment into the houses that has a lot of mold and mildew.
Just to stay with you for a second, Selah, I think one of the things that, taking the very long view of housing markets, many of us who teach about regional economic development, we might go back in time and think about how these housing markets were originally constructed and the kind of dynamics of redlining and the kind of segregated environment that we've inherited in our current moment. And so this idea of thinking about building in the suburbs and the kind of resistance that we can face, given people's wealth are tied up in those homes, there's a natural conservatism that can come with changing the built environment in a dramatic way. But at the same time, how do we undo some of those historic forces? What kind of, I was just recently hearing about a town in Connecticut that is trying to take by eminent domain a church, because the church is going to be building housing for the unhoused. And so with that kind of resistance, what are some of the mechanisms that you've been able to deploy, or where have you seen some bright spots in terms of really encouraging a more diverse set of housing stock in some of those 165 towns that aren't the big cities?
So that when I was a developer, before I was a commissioner, I was a developer, and I was able to build affordable housing in Guilford, Brantford, Southington. But it took time. It took time because it's the unknown. When you go and you talk to the residents, they don't know. The stigma of affordable housing is that some people have this meaning that people do not work, and that we're giving something to them and they're not working for. But that's not the reality. So when people listen and learn that is the person that is working at a daycare center, that is taking care of their kids, that is cooking for them, right? If they're good enough to give me a meal, they should be good enough to be my neighbors, or give me a margarita because I like the margaritas. So we need to spend a little bit of time. That's what I did when I was a developer. As a commissioner, we have actually all the towns they had to submit an affordable housing plan. Every 5 years, they have to do an affordable housing plan. And what I did before it was due 2 years before was that we provided a guide in how to do an affordable plan, how to reach out to the neighbors, how to bring the community together with the Regional Plan Association. And we were pretty successful. Not everybody did them in a way that was going to be implemented, but a lot of them did. And we also provided financial resources not only to do that, but for feasibility analysis of their land. And we're working with some towns that really are taking that approach and working more with their community. Not everybody's going to be in agreement, but education and getting to know people and build that relationship is very important.
Mm-hmm. So, David, one of the things that strikes me about the Mint model is the emphasis on mixed income. And I think that's kind of some of the focus of some of the work that Selah's doing, even things like using the state LIHTC points system to try to steer affordable housing towards what we might call high opportunity neighborhoods, to really try to build in more affordability in very wealthy neighborhoods. But tell us a bit about your approach and what inspired it, and how you're seeing these dynamics that we're talking about playing out at the neighborhood level, and how Mint responds to that.
Sure, and thank you for having me on here. It's great to be here. I think a key thing to the neighborhood level for us, and having that mix of incomes inside of each mixed income neighborhood trust, and there are now 5 of these mixed income neighborhood trusts we've helped set up across the country in Fresno, Tulsa, Kansas City, Boston, and then just late last year, Denver and Aurora in the East Colfax neighborhood on the border. And really key to all these neighborhoods is they're facing a paradox for the residents, where they've experienced redlining disinvestment for decades, and now they're seeing investment and opportunity come into the neighborhood, but that is coming with displacement. And so residents would talk about, we are facing disinvestment or displacement. This seems an unfair paradox. At the same time, you have this almost opportunity of the fact that you have higher income housing being built or existing housing being turned into higher income housing in that neighborhood, if you can work with existing neighborhood-based organizations, put that under the same ownership model under community governance, there's then tying it to preservation of existing housing, that's not the same highest return as a lot of these outside investors which they're fighting against, but that's an okay return, is under community governance. Community governance and a lot of the partners you work with just outperform people who are outside the neighborhood anyway, both in values alignment, certainly, and use of the neighborhood, but also just they are better at knowing their neighborhood and running housing in their neighborhood, and for the one in Tulsa, building housing in their neighborhood. And then it creates a long-term financially sustainable ownership structure. It provides that subsidy for some lower income groups, which both will always need it, and also in today's context, certainly, but even under better years prior, the political will is just not there to provide resources for these residents as they're facing this dilemma. I think at the broadest level, that therefore looks like what we hope is a reset social contract in these neighborhoods. Of right now, we constantly heard in setting up the model and working with the first two neighborhoods in Tulsa and Kansas City on creating it, the residents would talk about this broken social contract where they felt that them making their neighborhood a better place to live not only did not make their life better, it made their life worse. And the numbers pan out for this is if you look at gentrifying neighborhoods, lower income renters are pushed out to neighborhoods with less security, less education outcome, less opportunity, less health. And residents get this. They are smart. There was a resident in Kansas City who talked about the fact that he stopped attending trash pickups because he went, who am I picking this trash up for? Is it for me or for my landlord's going to kick me out once there's no more trash? Likewise, you work with East Boston. East Boston, the neighborhood, residents had fought very hard to get better transit access on the Blue Line that is one stop away from East Boston. Those very same residents, literally the same residents in the same homes, were then part of a set of housing that was branded as the Blue Line portfolio because it was now such great transit access, and they were kicked out of those with higher rents. We worked with City Life Vida Urbana, a tenant organizing group that helped some of those fight those higher rents. But the pain of the fact that you went to City Hall and the transit authority to fight for a better neighborhood and then saw that made your life worse is something we're trying to reset here.
Mm-hmm. Your model reminds me a bit of the Kensington Corridor Trust in
Absolutely,
Philadelphia,
yeah.
which I think what's interesting about these models is they aren't only interested in building in affordability, but they're also models that allow for the gentrification dynamic, which is improving the conditions of the neighborhood to unfurl, but the current residents benefit from them. So in the Kensington Corridor model, they're systematically buying up commercial properties along the neighborhood corridor, and they could make them very affordable for local businesses, or they could charge the highest rent available because all of the income flows to a neighborhood trust that's controlled by the community and then can be deployed by the community however they want to reduce property tax, to send kids to college or whatever. So is it a similar model that you're sort of thinking about trying to harness those forces such that they're it's a virtuous circle?
Absolutely. So I think an answer to how the model came forward is the first thing that we had done is first we hoped there was another organization doing this, of supporting gentrifying neighborhoods with this kind of intervention, and unfortunately there was not. We then went and listened to a lot of different neighborhood-based organizations and housing groups across the country. One of those was Adriana and her team at the Kensington Corridor Trust. They were the ones who had actually brought forward the use of this legal structure called a perpetual purpose trust, which has mostly been used in operating companies. The most prominent now is Patagonia, is controlled by perpetual purpose trust. More trendy now, Anthropic AI has a perpetual purpose trust. The only other use I know of in real estate and community development is the Kensington Corridor Trust. Yeah. All five of the that's what we set up for the legal structure for all of these, because you're basically restoring a fiduciary responsibility that still can serve financial responsibility and investors, but also has a much broader and very strong guardrails towards purpose, which for us is anti-displacement and neighborhood benefit.
Mm-hmm. And are you building from scratch, or are you acquiring properties, or does it depend on the region where you're working?
Well, I think one key is we're always backing an existing neighborhood-based organization, and then two, almost entirely have done acquisition and renovation. The one in Tulsa, partly with, as a neighborhood undergoes change more, new construction makes more sense. They've also done some strategic infill on vacant lots.
Mm-hmm. And do you have a critical number of properties you try to acquire? I know in Philadelphia, they just began. They had a few. Now they've got, I don't know, 20 or 30 properties, but they just started slowly and continued to add.
Yeah, I think it depends on what kinds of scale you're getting from a neighborhood partner. I think a lot of the things we're focused on is sustainable operations going forward. So we had heard from neighborhood groups, we're trying to run 8 units of housing, and you're just underwater from day one. So we're always focused on 100 units or more.
Yeah.
But that can vary with a lot of nuance.
Yes. Okay, so I want to, David's helping us turn toward thinking about some of these innovative interventions into this housing market that Selah and Jenny helped us describe. And so just continuing with thinking about the cost dynamics, right? One of the issues that Jenny brought up is the fact that, costs are such that we're going to have quote unquote market failure, right? Over exclusion based on inability to pay for a certain subset of Americans. One of the ways that innovation sometimes work is it can help, disrupt those typical processes of production and create, sort of cheaper ways to produce. And we haven't seen that happening in housing, right? Except lately, we hear about some potential innovation that might change those cost drivers, right? It's been wood, steel, concrete, and labor for, the majority of our history of our housing market, but we're starting to hear about mass timber, 3D printing. There's some potential, but maybe haven't quite hit scale. So Selah, what are you seeing out there? And is there anything that especially excites you in this space of manufacturing, construction, any innovation on the building side of housing that you have your eye on?
Sure, it's complicated. So we have used trying to explore new ways of doing things, cost and time, right? How do we make it more efficient, sustainability, green, and all of that. We have experimented with mass timber. We funded a project actually here in New Haven, 360 Dixwell Avenue. And they have had some challenges because they brought their material from overseas, and when it came here, it was damaged. So they have not only time and cost because they have to wait for the new material to come in. So I have not seen, it's beautiful, it's going to be beautiful, but I have not seen what we expected to see. Modular, we're experimenting with home ownership, and actually it has been pretty good because it has accelerated the construction, and also the design is beautiful, and we are saving money in just standardizing one design and this is in a small community in Litchfield where we're doing 10 houses for sale. And in 2 months, they put together 2 houses ready for sale. So I think that we have a lot of promises on that for more homeownership in field, as well. 3D, I have heard about it. I think it's in California. I'm a little intrigued, but it's a lot of concrete that goes into it. But I also have seen something called like a Lego blocks, and you can build high buildings, high rises. So I'm intrigued for that, and I would like to explore a little more. So I will probably this semester the clinic can do a little more work for us, right? A little, because we have to explore other ways while we're still doing our regular stick building and continue that production.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things about mass timber, as I understand it, is that we have these kind of leaps in cost, right? It's not linear. So when you get from 3 to 4 stories, you have to move from wood to steel, and that creates some complication, or you have to add an elevator. And then again, from 7 to 8, there's kind of a huge, jump in the cost such that you have in the built environment gaps in density. Right? And mass timber, as I understand it, solves for that. You don't have that same dynamic. And with the offsite construction, you're reducing the time quite a bit. It might be a little more expensive, but you're reducing the time. So these things have some potential. Jenny, you've written about kind of less dramatic ways that we could save money on some of these costs, right?
Yeah, it's helpful to think about sort of the categories of costs for constructing housing. We have the land, we have construction materials, whether that's wood or steel or concrete. We have the labor. The financing is a big piece because developers have to borrow money in order to do this. And the time is a big part of this as well. The longer it takes you to build, the longer you are expending funds without getting any income, right? So these are sort of all of the frontiers, and we really need to be thinking about bringing down the costs on all of those, right? Land is expensive in places where people want to live. You can't change the cost of land, but you can put more homes on a piece of land, and so you spread the land costs over more different households. That's one of the fundamental reasons behind zoning reforms, just putting more homes on a piece of expensive land. For the materials, experimenting with new kinds of underlying materials like mass timber is certainly part of it. But some of this is also thinking about the regulations about how much material of various kinds you have to use for things, right? And so we have built into our building code, for instance, the requirement that most new apartment buildings have to have two separate exits. So, how many of you have lived in a, say, 1920s apartment building? It's like a walk-up building. There's a central stair. Maybe there's an elevator, but everything's organized kind of around that central core. Those are illegal to build today. Now you have to build something that has two separate entrances. And so we wind up with what are called double-loaded corridors. So if you think of a hotel, right, you've got a big corridor in the middle. You've got hotel rooms or apartments on either side of that. And then you've got an elevator and a stair at either end. That corridor is really expensive because it's not generating any income. It's not that developers want to do that or that it's physically necessary for the structural soundness of the building. That's something that we have written into our code. And by the way, that is something the US has imposed on itself that other countries don't do. In Europe, it's still possible to build these single core buildings, which are just a much more efficient floor plan. There's a whole list of things, the size of the elevators that we build in the US is bigger than most. We require very wide streets, in part so that fire trucks and emergency vehicles have access to them. In Japan, rather than requiring the streets to be really wide, they build smaller fire trucks, right? We could, in theory, do things like that too. So there are a million of these kind of small tweaks to the way we build that are written into our codes that make it more expensive to build all kinds of stuff. And what we
have one exit, you need big fire trucks.
We have all of these small individual rules that individually add up to a lot. And really one of the biggest pieces of cost right now is the time that it takes to build. And that again is a function of the process that you have to go through your community process. You have to go through rezoning. You have to go through design review. You have to go in front of the community and present your plans. And they don't like the exterior materials. They want it to look different. They want the landscaping done differently. So you have to go back to your architect and redo all of this. All of those changes, this discretionary process that takes a lot of time is very, very expensive. And this is something I think we in the housing space need to be better at explaining. It's not just the hard costs. It's not just the sort of rigid rules that are written on paper. It's this discretionary process. Everybody wants to weigh in on what the building in their neighborhood looks like. But when everybody gets to weigh in, the finished product is going to be more expensive. We're going to have less of it. And a bunch of people aren't going to be able to afford to live there.
So David, are you solving for some of these dynamics? Are you experimenting with some of these new technologies? How are you thinking about this if you're building 100 new units or renovating 100, acquiring and renovating 100 units? Tell us about how your project.
Well, I'd say one, totally agree on these factors, and is the fire department controls, which are just outside zoning, is just consistently pains for a lot of cities. I think a key thing to the particular neighborhood trust work, I'd worked in city planning in New York City, and they were working on rezonings of neighborhoods, and I think seeing how difficult that was, and the fact that even in the context of those rezonings with anti-displacement, people were still getting displaced from the particular neighborhoods while being told you're opening up more housing supply so that the overall city can decrease its housing prices by a fraction of a percent. And shockingly, the next neighborhood down the line would say, I do not want that, and fight the upzoning, which entirely made sense. So I think really key for us is also working in a pragmatic sense of saying, outside of waiting for zoning changes, waiting for political will, how are you improving housing quality, preventing displacement, building community power, right where you begin, and then hopefully through building those trusting relationships and that power at neighborhood level, it creates a very strong, stable place from which bigger decisions and civic contribution can be taken.
Mm-hmm. So staying with you, David, I mean, another place we might see innovation besides the construction materials is on the financing and the ownership side of the equation. And that's really squarely in your camp in terms of your model is developing a new governance structure for housing. And so could you share with us more about the financing side of things and
Sure.
and what you're learning about what it takes to create a neighborhood level governance structure to oversee a portfolio of housing?
Yeah, well, I think in some ways, I mean, there's the radical side of it's a new structure of a perpetual purpose trust. And in some ways, given this is confusing, given there's a lot of community land trusts also in the world, community land trusts all use a nonprofit incorporated model. To our knowledge, we've not run across one that's a literal trust yet. So it's funny sometimes that the radical thing we're doing is setting up neighborhood trusts that are trusts. But that governance mechanism does allow then on the economic side to bring in a capital stack that I think the biggest value add there is equity investors in the operating company of each neighborhood trust. And that equity has come forward for the neighborhood trusts in a way that I think has been surprising to a lot of the neighborhood-based organizations. Sometimes not as much because they're like, we clearly see the fact there's a lot of equity investment happening in our neighborhood, just not aligned with us. I think has brought new resources to bear. That has been exciting to the cities and states that have participated because they've seen their dollars go further. So something like, actually basically everyone in the neighborhood trusts have now had public support, which you would not build a model for, but they're brought to that by the fact that part of the capital stack is equity investors. So like the $54 million East Boston Neighborhood Trust project has $5.5 million in equity investments in there. And those are mostly investors who are really in there for the long term for an okay return on their equity investment, but also they want to see this impact. And they want to see their money put into a good place. And they came to it for a variety of reasons. Some were family offices, some were individuals who lived in the neighborhood but have done well. I think we're kind of moving almost in parallel with this shifting landscape of this massive generational transfer of wealth to a lot of people who especially are younger and going, I have plenty of wealth, I want to go to good places. And a number of those people have come forward and gone, we like this structure as a way to put that money to use, and that makes a lot of these projects more feasible. So you'd end up in a $54 million East Boston Neighborhood Trust with public subsidy, senior debt. There's some subordinated debt, which has like foundations and program-related investments. But I think really critical to the structure is that $5.5 million of equity, which otherwise would not have been able to participate in another structure.
Mm-hmm. And what about on the governance side? So what is the ask of the community in terms of their participation in the governance structure?
Yeah, so here there are two governing boards, each neighborhood trust. There's an operating board of that operating company that entirely reports to the trust stewardship committee at the trust. Those both have the neighborhood-based partner and renting residents on those. The operating board skews a little more towards other neighborhood stakeholders and housing experts on there to be able to help build the institution. The trust stewardship committee has other aligned seats to help hold it to its purpose. All of that is then following the purpose agreement you can kind of think of as a constitution for this neighborhood trust, which is both strong enough guardrails that it will always serve anti-displacement and benefit, but a little more flexible than, say, a regulatory agreement. And a big part of this is it's being set in perpetuity. What anti-displacement and neighborhood benefit looks like will change over time. I think a powerful example of that from the homeownership side is a couple of the neighborhood trusts have done some from total vacancy acquisition of vacant single-family housing and renovation, but they end up with single-family rentals under it. Both of those neighborhoods have been interested in long-term seeing those be used for homeowners, but a lot of the residents talk about this tension between the people who are fighting for homeownership don't really care about the renters. The renters are worried about the push for homeownership means they'll get kicked out. And so the trust says those single-family rentals can be transitioned to homeownership as long as they serve anti-displacement by recycling the dollars for infill or other rentals. And also in the disposition of those properties, they go towards anti-displacement focused homeownership. one nugget of this was a neighborhood talking about a nonprofit very focused on building homeownership that did a ribbon cutting for a new homeowner down the block, and everyone on the block knew the renting family that had been evicted, so that could be emptied for a homeowner. And we're going, we don't get why everyone's celebrating this new homeowner on our block when our neighborhood's being torn apart by this ribbon cutting. And you go, that's not an impossible thing to solve for if you have a bunch of houses being stewarded in a way that when one opens up and is empty, or when a family's ready to move on homeownership, it's not rocket science to just do that extra effort to really solve for everyone the neighborhood's needs. But unfortunately, right now, it's just not done in solving for some of these single metrics.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, Selah, in your work, you came into the Department of Housing, and you had a portfolio that was largely focused on affordability, and you've really moved up market, as I understand it, right? Developing some new initiatives, the developer subsidy, thinking about that missing middle part of the housing market. And so what's been your experience? Do you see a lot of uptake of these new capital subsidies, and what's the impact you see happening as those roll out?
Sure. So remember, I was a developer, right? So I hit my head on the wall like for many, many years because I didn't get the money fast enough, and we're spending a lot of money trying to get the developments going. So we did a couple of years ago, we provided to nonprofits $500,000 pre-development just as a line of credit. Take the money, do the projects. You don't have to come in for every project. So we did that with 6 organizations, and then we invited a bank, and the bank actually matched some operating resources that I gave to the nonprofits. So keep doing the work because they really cover and fill that gap for the affordability for most of the units. Last year or a year and a half ago, we had the interest rate went high. So high, we have gaps in some of our projects. And talking to the banks, they told us, well, they have a lot of for-profit developers, market rate housing in the pipeline, but resources weren't there. We created, the governor wanted to put and set up a loan fund, $200 million. And what we did was we worked with the banks to come up with a process where the developers didn't have to come to us. The bank underwrote the loan. We are subordinating that loan between 1 and 3% interest rate, as long as they give us 20% of the market rate affordable for the middle income. So between 60% and 120% of area median income. We have in a year almost 2,000 units with that particular project, because first of all, the governor said, he challenged me, first of all. He said, Selah, nobody wants to do business with the department or with CHAFA. I'm also the board chair of CHAFA, the Connecticut Housing Finance Authority. And he said, you're too slow. They all complain. And I said, okay, so we want to change this. And we talked to the banks, and the banks said, absolutely. So we created an intercreditor agreement with them. And I mentioned before in another place that I was, with $200 million, we have 1 staff. I mean, the efficiencies that we have with 1 staff, because we take the work that the bank does, and we funnel the money through CHFA, which is our administrator for that program, and it has been pretty successful. All the for-profit developers are coming. And then I said, well, give me 10 more, give me 30% or 40%. So we're negotiating on that. And it has been pretty successful. And then on the time to own that you mentioned, 2 years ago, we created the program for down payment assistance and closing costs, up to $25,000, 10 years forgivable. Up to 100% of area median income is the requirement for income. And what we did was, instead of giving it to some of the CDFIs, which we have done down payment assistance before, CDFIs, you go to one of the organizations to do the class, you go to the bank to get your approvals, it takes 30 days, 60 days, and then you lose your home because the market was so hot. If you didn't have cash, you didn't play in the market. Yeah. So what we did was, hey, let's just use FHA. The banks are already doing the underwriting for the mortgage. They can also do the underwriting for the loan, and we'll just funnel the money through them. And we did that. In less than 2 years, we had 6,000 people that became first-time homeowners. So as I said to my staff sometimes, is that these are the same programs. It's just we look at it a different way and we administer differently. We didn't change any of the programs, right? We changed the way the process is. And I said to them, we can't expect a different outcome if we keep doing the same thing all over again. So sometimes when we have the ability to look, how can we make and accelerate sometimes our process. Now, I'm still working on our regular affordable housing pipeline, because that one takes us a little longer. We have been able to utilize the 4% tax credit because we have money from the state, $400 million every year, to continue the production. So that allows us to use and to fill that gap from the 9%, because the 9% brings real resources, but the 4% creates that gap, especially because I'm doing a lot of more affordable units at 50% and below. So we have been able to do that, and our pipeline of 7,000 units we have is because we have utilized state funding and 4%. So we're bringing the investor. Now I have to work on that piece because it's taking a little too long. And then, of course, we have our sister organizations like DECD that has other programs that we bring them together. And with them, we're trying also, again, if it's housing, let's just utilize one underwriting from CHFA, from DOH, and work together so that we can accelerate the process.
Mm-hmm. I mean, one of the things that you're getting is that there are lots of funders in the space who touch housing in different ways. And, the vast majority of homes that get built in the U.S. are financed and built entirely by the private sector. So, developers, private for-profit developers will get some equity from private investors. They will go to a bank. They will get a construction loan. The apartment building gets a permanent loan. So there's a whole world of private finance. And that is vastly larger than all of the public money, right? So, federal, state, local, philanthropic is a drop in the bucket compared to private capital markets. So we have to continue to be able to tap private capital for most housing. And for middle and high income households, that's fine. The problem is that when we get to putting requirements on the income from the building that has to serve low-income households and there has to be a subsidy, the private sector isn't going to do that. And so that's where the public sector comes in. We have these complicated structures of federal tax credits and some state programs and below market loans and bonds. And, for building a tax credit project, it's not unusual to have 8 or 10 different sources of funding. Putting all of those 8 to 10 sources together and making the rules align correctly and the timing of them align, that's also expensive. You have to have people who know how to do that stuff, right? So it would be great if the financing of 100% affordable housing were as simple and easy as going to the bank and getting a loan, but it's not, which makes it more expensive to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did, with the ARPA funds, actually got $50 million. We were able to do 200 units. We've funded completely 100% for 50% and below. And we did some acquisitions from the private sector. There were units that we convinced the owner to sell it to us, and we acquired 3 months in Westport. We got 19 units, 2 and 3 bedrooms.
Yeah. So Jenny, our time is going so fast, so I wanted to touch on some of the national zoning kind of from the top zoning shock reform that we're seeing, right? So we talked about how a lot of housing regulation happens at the local jurisdiction, but we're starting to see states take matters into their own hand and do things like quote unquote abolish single family housing, which
we're not going to say that. We're not going to say that.
No, but we're going to say
we are making it easier to build homes of all shapes and sizes in all communities.
There you go.
Very important, right? The language matters a lot.
Yeah.
Language matter.
Yes. So thinking about, in the state of Connecticut, if 80% of our buildable land is zoned for single family only as of right, it would take a long process to move a site, and lots of sites out of that as of right zoning code. So in your if you could share with us what you're seeing at the national level and what we're learning about what happens when all of a sudden any single family in the city can as of right go up to a duplex or or a triplex or even a 4-unit.
Yeah. And I'll give you a national picture, but to be clear, almost all of the experimentation is happening at the state level and at the local level, right? The federal government has no authority over zoning. That's just not in its constitutional powers. And so this is really happening at the state level, in part because states originally owned the power over land use and they delegated it to local governments. And now they are deciding to take some of it back or put guardrails around it. And that's a contentious issue. Some local governments are litigating this through the court system, but more than 20 states have now passed some form of statewide policy to encourage more housing supply. There are lots of different flavors. So the most common form so far has been state governments preempting local governments from banning accessory dwelling units, basically saying local governments, you have to allow accessory dwelling units as of right in all of your residential neighborhoods. So anybody who has a single family house could build an apartment in their basement or in their garage, right? And so that's sort of the lightest touch version of this. It's still not easy politically to get that through. That is still contentious. At the other end of the spectrum, there are pushes to get larger apartment buildings in either commercial zones or near transit and jobs. So that's a different approach. It's strategically identifying places where there's high land values and high demand for people to live there, and often the infrastructure to support larger communities, and saying we want to make it easier to, for instance, just build apartments any place where you have a strip shopping center. So the state of Florida passed the Live Local Act a couple years ago that said that, if there's a single story strip shopping center in a parking lot surrounded by 10-story condo buildings, which is all over the state of Florida, that a developer can basically buy that single-story shopping center and put up a 10-story apartment building as of right? So it's matching the neighborhood height that's already there. In commercial and industrial mixed-use zones, you can just do that. And this has been actually very successful, and in 2 years, they have, I believe, more than 30,000 units that are already completed or in the pipeline. So it's actually a very efficient way of getting a lot of housing online. So we have lots and lots of experimentation at the state level. Connecticut is in the process of trying to push through an omnibus that would legalize apartments near transit. You have fantastic train service. It'd be great if more people could live close to it. Reduce parking requirements, which can be very expensive to add. Sort of a whole package of things that would make it easier to build different kinds of homes in more locations with less of these procedural hurdles.
HB 5002, call your senators.
There you go.
Passed the House yesterday, going to the Senate.
Yeah. Okay, so, I think I wanted to end just thinking about our current moment, right? We're in an era of norm busting and disruptions to the status quo. We even hear rumors that HUD could be on the chopping block. Things like Section 8 might be rethought. And I just wonder, from our panelists, sometimes we spend a lot of time holding on to systems that don't work great, but because they're the only thing we have. And so just in the spirit of the nature of our panel, if we were to have all of those programs wiped out and we flash forward to our rebuilding phase, where are some places where, if you were building from scratch, what are some policy ideas or some program ideas that you'd like to put out there? And then, just thinking broadly about all of the kind of innovative ideas we've been talking about. What's at stake if we get it right, and what's at stake if we don't? So maybe we'll start with you, David.
A lot is at stake.
Yeah.
I think two things being focused on from my mentality around that is, one, where can you create durable assets that are protected from a lot of the volatility happening? I think within housing, something for the neighborhood trusts is baked into the fact they now own mixed income housing. Even if vouchers drop out, the neighborhood trusts are not built around that. They have income coming in. They've been very stable in the midst of a very volatile time compared to a lot of other housing. And so where can you set up those institutions and assets that can weather storms as well as be secure foundations to build greater impact from? The second would be looking at places where either there is shared political will, which is a scary possibility. But I think there are places on that. We were talking about the formerly pro-Housing Act on creating supply across the country from the old administration that may need some rebranding, but feels like it could survive under the current one, even though it's currently not. But also, I think there are lots of places where even just finer-tuned process reform. I think on anti-displacement in New York City particularly, but across the board, you see this where people get off a waiting list for a housing unit that is often geographically agnostic in the city. And so you'd end up in New York with a family who now is living in the Bronx for their job in Brooklyn, and there's an identical other family in an identical income band in an identical unit on the other side of the city. And there's some places where you go, can we just let them swap apartments? Like there's so many things where it doesn't really require a lot of new resources and new processes, but looking at where people are and what their needs are could make their lives much better. And I think this is probably a time that invites us to do that.
So I think we're likely to continue needing two different kinds of subsidies for low-income households. We've moved very much away from the traditional public housing model. And to be honest, I don't think the U.S. is going to ever do that particularly well because it relies on Congress continuing for the next 100 years to fund operations and maintenance. And let's be honest, Congress is just not going to be reliable for doing that. I think on the sort of deeply subsidized units that are owned by public or nonprofit entities, we need to have other models to finance that. A number of states and cities are experimenting with sort of revolving loan funds where they use bonding from the state or local agency to pay for construction. Those are still relatively new, and so we haven't seen what happens when they hit 20 years and they need new building systems, new roofs, new elevators. That is really the kicker with public funding. You have to have long-term public funding or ways to raise new rounds of capital, just as private owners do. And we haven't really figured out how to do that and how to guarantee that that will be built in the long run, including across the change of political administrations at the state and local government. So I worry a little bit about how we build in that long-term durability over political change. The one where we know the sort of better changes are on household-based assistance, so housing vouchers. Vouchers are enormously successful in helping people get access to privately owned housing in higher opportunity communities where you couldn't build deeply subsidized housing and giving people flexibility to move close to their jobs. And we know that for people who get vouchers, that this is just a life changer. We could make some improvements to vouchers. There's interest, actually bipartisan interest in trying direct rental assistance, so cash instead of a voucher that makes it easier for landlords to work with the program. There are some other things like making the inspection system more flexible. So figuring out how to get cash into people's pockets and allowing them to use it with the flexibility that the rest of us have to spend the cash on the things that they need, including housing. How do we do that in a way that people trust that the cash is actually being used for things? How do we expand the number of landlords who are willing to accept that? Those are solvable problems, and that's actually one of the bright spots because Republicans are interested in less government administrative overhead and empowering the private sector, and Democrats are interested in how we stretch our subsidy dollars to cover more households.
Well, disruption and change and money is good. Disruption with change and no money, not good. Yeah. Not great. So Section 8. Actually, Connecticut has a rental assistance program, and we have almost the state. So we get the Section 8 comes to the state. We are also a housing authority, and then to the rest of the housing authorities. So we receive about $500 million overall. This is the state overall. The state housing program is smaller. It's about probably 40% of what they receive from Section 8. So we have a venue. We're going to have resources. We will have to work with our bosses and see if we could put some money into the rental assistance to increase that capacity. Make it simpler and do a lot of what you mentioned, Jenny, because there is a lot of room for improvement on the Section 8. Continue producing housing that is deep, affordable, that doesn't require Section 8 subsidy like you're talking about. We will do that. But with this new, I make a joke about this beautiful big bill that passed yesterday. This is Connecticut housing bill. we have a pilot in there for cash assistance. So we're going to be working with one of the foundations, and we're going to match the state, I think, because it still have to go, if it passed the Senate, because it's still not, will be $4 million to select families that are on the wait list for project-based and provide them with cash assistance as a pilot. So we'll see how that works.